Gracious, loving God, we give you thanks for the joys we have to come together, to learn about our church, to learn about one another, to build up friendships. And we thank you that we have the freedom in which to do that, freedom to express our faith. So we ask your guidance to be with us as we study a little bit of history tonight that might strengthen us in our commitment and our conviction to be your children. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. Okay. You see, what's up here is not about where you came from. And you're going to get that chance. This part of this is from the presentation that we give to new members that really want to learn about the church. And you'll see when we get to about the third slide, you're going to have some choice here tonight. I'm going to take you through stuff and show you where you came from, and you'll identify with certain areas, and maybe you won't. And then, depending on how far we get tonight, I've got stuff at home that I'm working on that has to do with the Finns and the Swedes, and the Danes and the Norwegians and the Germans, Muhlenberg and Salzgeber and Hans Nielsen Hauge and Grundtvig and, well, all those good guys, which I could bring in next week. Or if you feel at the end of tonight you'd like to learn more about the church, we have different ways to do this, because this was originally a 4-session study. You know what I say, it's a 2-session study now. And what we're looking at tonight is the history of the Reformation very briefly, and the Lutherans in America. And Lutherans today, Lutheran cooperation, Lutheran fellowship, who do we get along with, who don't we get along with, all that kind of stuff. Then I have 2 sections on what Lutherans believe and teach. One that deals with the creeds, the Augsburg Confession, the Small Catechism, the other, the Lord's Prayer, 10 Commandments, and the Apostles and the Sacraments. And then there's another section that I can go to that has to do with why we worship the way we do as Lutherans, the importance of music in the church, how to listen to a sermon, what's the proper posture in church. Anybody have any idea what that's about? When you sit and when you stand, right. When you stay awake, when you fall asleep. We're going to look at the church year and look at the Hope Lutheran in the villages. That's one of our choices, 2, 3, or 4. We're going to do one tonight, okay? So you'll see as we get on here, I'll give you the other choice, and you'll see why it's going to involve a lot more work, but I'm willing to do it. Okay. Very much remember that Luther was born in 1483. And so when we start talking about Lutherans coming to America, beginning in the 1600s, 1700s, and then the 1800s, you put that in the perspective that some of them were only 150, 175 years after the Reformation. So you had to ask, where they were coming from, why they were coming from there, what was being taught there. When we talk about the first Swedes that come to Delaware and Germans that come to Philadelphia and so forth. When Luther was when Luther was bringing about the Reformation, there was a little distinction between government and church. The emperor got along with the Pope got along with the emperor. They tickled each other's bellies or something, I don't know what. But the Roman Empire ended up consulting with the Pope on just about everything they did. By Luther's death, which came in 1546, the world had changed, just in those 60-some years. Sacraments went from 7 to 2. Religious activities completely changed. People were involved in the church. They weren't just pew sitters, as we call them today. And in those days, you'd have to call them floor standers, because most of the churches didn't have pews. And wouldn't you be thrilled to sit there for 3 hours listening to Luther preach? You know, and services did go that long, and people did come. The Roman Church has split in two, with more splits to come after that. Yes, dear?
When you say the sacraments went from 7 to 2, you're saying from Catholicism to Lutheranism?
Yes,
okay.
Basically. Thank you. The modern notion of the state church begins with the Reformation. Within 50 years, you have the Scandinavian countries declaring, whether they were Lutheran or not, or whether they were Roman Catholic, they all declared Lutheran. You have Great Britain becoming Anglican at that point. Netherlands becomes Dutch Reformed, so that the state church really has begun by the time Luther dies. So a whole new thinking about life now and God's gift of eternal life begin to emerge. Okay, so the Reformation begins, and we all know Luther posted the 95 Theses on the Castle Church door. Anybody here been to Heidelberg? Okay, in Heidelberg. Wittenberg. Well, my father-in-law was going to Wittenberg as a student when my wife was born in Ohio. Not Wittenberg, Germany. The Castle Church store at Wittenberg. One of the many main attacks was against the sale of indulgences. And Tetzel was a representative of the Pope covering Germany, selling pieces of the cross, and as well as selling masses, but by and large selling trinkets that were to have some religious value in order to build what we today know as St. Peter's Cathedral. It's on April 15th, we're not far from that, 1521, that Luther gave a speech at the Diet of Worms. Diets were gatherings, what would we call them today? We call them political, religious conflabs of some sort. Anybody? Somebody said, kind of a conference, but it was a reason why the Pope could pull together all the bishops and all the people that knew a lot about the church, and that's where Luther was really, that was his trial. That was his trial. And they asked him to recant of all the things that he had said about the selling of indulgences and other 94 things with it that he was. If you looked at the 95 Theses, you scratch your head on about 70 of them, but some of them. So at that point, Luther declares, "Here I stand. I cannot do other. This is what I believe." So that's your Reformation. I put this up as a castle because it's right after the Diet of Worms, when Luther is headed back toward Wittenberg, that he's thinks that he's being attacked by a group of thieves or something, and they're really part of the Duke's men who take him not captive, but protect him and take him to the castle at Wartburg. And there is where he translates the New Testament into German. So people in medieval times really had low expectations of the church. They didn't expect the church to do things for them. They went. That was it, kind of like Christmas and Easter Christians are today. Did I say that? The Lutheran reformers were Catholic. That's something we need to remember. They were Catholic. And remember this, above all others. It was a reformation, not a revolution. That was not his intent ever, to split from the Roman Catholic Church. But in those days people weren't allowed to choose their own religion, and realize that Martin Luther wasn't the only reformer out there. We have lots of other people. Sue?
You said people weren't allowed to choose their own religion. What other religions were there? I mean, was Jewish, Muslim?
Well,
I mean, anything else besides
No,
being a Catholic?
this would be after the Lutheran Church formulated itself, if I can put it that way, and decided among the various duchies of Germany, each duchy had a duke, of course, and so the duke would decide, are we going to be Catholic or are we going to be Lutheran? Be Catholic or evangelical. I'll point that out in a minute. So that's where the people didn't have a choice. If you didn't like what it was, you move across the county line. And basically that's what they were, counties.
I was reading this before.
This is being recorded for the whole world.
Oh, no. I was thinking, I was reading this before Luther came into the picture.
No.
You know, what other religions were there? There was basically, I look at 3.
Well, the
Being a
Orthodox Church
Catholic,
existed.
being Jewish, or being Muslim.
You have the Orthodox Church existing from about 1010, something like that, on. So there was the split off of the Roman Catholic Church into the Orthodox Church. There was Judaism. Yeah, it's Dave says it's almost a Western question.
Well, when you're talking about they're not able to choose their own religion, you're talking about the Christianity. They were not able to choose which
Right.
observation of Christianity.
See, aren't you glad I brought her tonight? I don't think so. Maybe I won't let her. But here are some other reformers. You've all heard of John Huss, who was burned at the stake. Calvin and Knox, both were in the Swiss Reformed place. Zwingli, he kind of was between France and Switzerland. And Wycliffe. Wycliffe was the Englishman who first translated the Bible into English. And we're going to have a special class here on May the 9th. Just set it in stone last week. A gentleman lives in the villages, he and his wife. They were Wycliffe Bible translators for 18 years. And these are people who go out into tribal areas that have no written language. And they have to learn the language, then they have to create an alphabet, have to win the love of the people, and then they can translate the Gospel of Luke into the language so that the people can read it. So he's going to be here, and my understanding is that he does have a PowerPoint to go with it and talk about what the Wycliffe Bible translators do. It'll be Wednesday morning, because by then we'll be into one class, and they are headquartered in Orlando. Very few people realize that, but it's a very quiet group without much bureaucracy, just a lot of mission work going on.
Did
So that's-
Wycliffe work for King James?
Did Wycliffe work for King James? No, he did not work for King James. Luther and his colleagues cared about what you heard and learned about church. Remember the previous slide? I said the church really didn't get involved in very much. But Luther and his colleagues cared about what you heard and learned, and that gives rise to the Catechism, all the many writings that he did, and emphasizing the law and the gospel being primary in our lives. The law is like a mirror in which we see ourselves. The gospel is God's grace given to us for that purpose, to correct our lives and to give us the promise. And
Question. You shouldn't give me this microphone.
take it away, just a minute till I finish.
When you say
Wait a minute.
when you say law, you're talking about the 10 Commandments, not the Mosaic Law. Or are you talking about the Mosaic
Well,
Law?
it could be. There were some remnants of the Mosaic Law left, but by and large it'd be the Ten Commandments. But it wasn't all 683 laws in the book of Leviticus. But correctly dividing the word of truth, that gets connected with law and gospel. How do we divide that word that the Lord gives us? What is law that says, straighten out your lives and follow me? And what is gospel that says, I love you just the same? So we're going to get into where we want to be. So Lutheranism starts to grow. Dave, do you have a question? Okay, I'm a great auctioneer, you know that. Okay, followers of Luther were labeled Lutherans, not by Luther. Luther wanted to be an evangelical. And to this day, the evangelical Kirche Deutschland D is carrying out that word of evangelical that Luther wanted instead of Lutheran. Well, we'll still refer to it as the Lutheran Church in Germany today. Lutheranism became widespread in Germany, Sweden, Denmark, Norway, Iceland, and Finland. I didn't realize till, where were we talking to that gal from Iceland? Oh, she was in the doctor's office. She said 90% of Icelanders are Lutheran. So we don't put that together, but you do if you begin to include Iceland into the Scandinavian countries. And this is where the kings decided that they would be Lutheran, and the people became Lutheran. There's a lot going on there today because they were state churches and they were supported by the people's taxes. And now Sweden, for instance, about 2 years ago, maybe less than that, voted and decided that they had the choice. They don't have to support the church with their taxes anymore. They now can support other civic organizations. So if you're taxed at 7%, you either give it to the church or you can give it to some other good, caring organization. And I know that some of the other Scandinavian churches are looking at the same thing. Denmark might be the next one. Some of the earliest settlers in America came from these lands. You know, we build up and we talk about the wonderful Puritans and all those who landed at Plymouth Rock and all. And it wasn't many years after that that the Lutherans began to come to America. The first permanent colony of Lutherans was in the West Indies. Does anybody know what island in the West Indies was Lutheran? I heard somebody say St. Croix. St. Croix. There are two churches that are still in St. Croix that were founded in the 1600s, Frederickstadt and Christianstadt. And they're very interesting because when I was on the national stewardship, I was a national stewardship representative in South Carolina. I was to tutor a gal who was the stewardship director for the Puerto Rican Synod. And Puerto Rican Synod has 35 Lutheran churches. She said, but we also got these two down in St. Croix that get mad at us if we go down there and start speaking Spanish. So, but they're still part of our national evangelical Lutheran Church in America. One of the 65 synods includes these two churches in St. Croix. By the 1620s, that's what we said was Plymouth Rock, right? There were Lutheran settlements in America. The Dutch were on Manhattan Island in 1625. The Swedes came to Wilmington, Delaware in 1638. They didn't call it Wilmington, it was called something else then. I have all that at home if you want to hear it next week. The first Lutheran church to be built in the United States was built near Wilmington in 1646. So you see, we do go back quite a ways. These were Swedes. Any Swedes in here? Okay. So you can see that as some of your background. They later, I should say, they later got together with the Germans in Philadelphia, which was ultimately becomes the United Lutheran Church, the Lutheran Church in America, the Evangelical Lutheran Church, which I'm going to show you in a minute or two, that they kind of merged themselves together. So the Swedes were very open to cooperation with other groups. The German immigrants begin to arrive in the early 1700s. And the Salzgebers came to Georgia in 1734. If you go up I-95, you'll see a sign for Rincon, Georgia. And when you're on I-95, and that church still exists nearby Rincon in Ebenezer, that was built in 1740, 1745, somewhere around there. There's a retreat center there. And a lot of Lutheran groups in the Carolinas go there for a retreat center. But the church is still, I don't want to say real active, because Ebenezer was a church that was built around farming and logging. And when the forests began to get all torn down for logs, the people start to move on. So at its pinnacle, they say it had like 6,000 population, but now that's down below 3,000. But it's still there, still exists. And think about that. That's almost 300 years ago. So when did the Lutherans start to organize? I mean, how did we decide who was whom and where they were going? Henry Melchior Muhlenberg in 1748, that's before the American Revolution, he founded the Pennsylvania Synod. These were all the, when I say all the Lutheran churches, these were probably 15 to 20 Lutheran churches in eastern Pennsylvania. And then the Swedes came up from Delaware. Other synods followed, and they were formed in New York, North Carolina, and South Carolina. Surprisingly, North Carolina has well over 230 some Lutheran churches. It was very strong, very German. South Carolina, it's not as big a populated state, but we had, what did I say? 165 Lutheran churches in South Carolina. That, in fact, when I was installed as Director of Missions and Stewardship, I was installed in one of the two oldest churches in South Carolina. What city was that, dear? You know, that little country place. It was out by where you worked at the bank.
Yeah, Eller.
No, it was past Ellery.
Ellery, yeah, there we go.
Yeah, that's where your office was.
Wasn't St. Matthews.
No, it was before St. Matthews, but after Ellery.
Okay.
Anyway, that church still to this day argues with the church in Charleston as to which was the first Lutheran church in South Carolina. And when I was installed there, which would have been 20 years ago, it was back when my handicap was down to about 2. But at that point, they were arguing who was 275 years old and who is 276 years old. In the Midwest, now, when the Scandinavians begin to come to America, they see the East Coast kind of filled up with Germans, Swiss Presbyterians, and they see themselves as rural people, and they move on west, out even across Ohio, and ultimately they begin to form themselves in Illinois, moving on up to Wisconsin and then to Minnesota. The Germans kind of stayed lower and went to Iowa. So we'll talk about some of those more in a minute. But very many small synods were formed by the Norwegians, the Danes, the Finns, and other nations. And as the nation expanded, so did the number of Lutheran groups. So into the 1800s we go. And between 1840 and 1875, there were, I'm going to tell you what a synod is in a minute, there were 56 synods formed in America. Better not put that there, I'll probably spill it on my computer. In 1847, German immigrants came to Missouri. Now, the first boatload of them, I always have to tell this story, didn't want to land in New York and have to go through Ellis Island and everything else. You're looking at 1847. They wanted to go their own way. So they went on down and came down around Florida and went up the Mississippi. And when they got to St. Louis, they said, "This is heaven." And they're still there. We call them the Lutheran Church, Missouri Synod. Yes, they're still there, St. Louis. And so they were the first German. Other German immigrants then came and settled in the St. Louis and the Missouri area. But when you think about it, just below that, you've got Oklahoma. And just below it to the right, you've got Arkansas. And there are so few Lutherans there that you better not say you are one. They'll think you're from another country. Okay, those German immigrants who came to Missouri formed a synod to combat liberalism and Lutheranism in America. Wow. They saw these people who were coming into Illinois and Minnesota and Wisconsin as just being too liberal. They didn't have enough law. Why, I don't know. Because they were very conservative, very conservative. There are many movements within Lutheranism in the United States. I could probably spend an hour talking about these. But here are just some of the movements. Now, when you think, here's a synod in Illinois, and here's a synod in Wisconsin, here's a synod in Minnesota, they all of a sudden, they start splitting because they have different views of how the Bible ought to be interpreted and how education should be done. The Norwegians were very big on education. And when they went to Wisconsin, it was common knowledge, and it'd be around Muskego, a little west of Milwaukee up there, where one of the original settlements were. And they always tell the story that the first thing they built when they got there was the church. And the second thing they built was a school. Then they started building their own houses. But in that order, the church could serve as a school till they got the school built. And they could worship, and then they would build their houses. So that was just the one group in Wisconsin. Now, what kind of group was that? Well, let's take these one at a time. The revivalist group, there were some Lutherans, revivalists, normally who would speak the language of the people who had come to America. So you and I, some of us know, had grandparents that their primary language maybe was something other than English. And so you would have a Norwegian revivalist going to where there were a lot of Norwegians. You'd have a German revivalist in Pennsylvania holding revivals. They didn't necessarily start churches as much as they just held revivals. That was to get people thinking religiously, I guess. Confessional would be those who did come together and form synods and form groups and have established religions together. And they would share in, and I'll point out in a little bit, they would share in maybe the publication of materials. That becomes a big thing. The pietistical movement. The pietistical movement has a lot of its roots in Norway and in Denmark. And they are, they were the ones who did everything by prayer. They were the ones who came together for prayer meetings and study when they could. Everything was according to Scripture, they thought, and the Bible. Fundamentalists, we still have some Lutheran fundamentalists who believe literally word for word, and they're in small synods. We'll point those out in a minute. But here was the problem. They were all still looking back to their homeland for pastors. Think about that. That all, say, a shipload of Norwegians lands in New York and they get their Conestoga wagons or whatever and get over the Allegheny Mountains and head west. They would be speaking Norwegian for what? The whole generation. The children weren't exposed to other English-speaking people. So oftentimes their education was held in the native language. My own father, so this would go back to 1920, something like that. He went to what was called the German school in Sandusky, Ohio. Located right next to the junior high school was a they didn't have kindergarten, first grade through 8th grade German school. And much of their religious training was taught in German, even though they learned math and they'd have to take mandatory courses in English, but it was still called the German school. About that time, 1925 or so, they sold it to the city that made it part of the middle school where I went to school. And so it was the old stone building where you went for chemistry class. That's all I remember. But they were all still looking to their homeland for many years for pastors, looking for ones who wanted to be missionaries and come to America. But as second and third generations began to speak more English, a need arose to provide training and materials. And so now we're looking back into the middle 1800s to 1900 to see which groups would start colleges, seminaries, high schools. We had several Lutheran high schools that one still exists in Oak Grove, Illinois, I believe. Very famous Lutheran school. By the late 1800s, though, look at this. There were 150 distinct Lutheran bodies in America. I'm going to give you just, I think it's the next one. I used to be able to put it up here. I'm going to take our church today, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, and show you some of the groups who have ultimately come together to form this body that we call the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, which was formed officially on January 1st, 1988. January 1st, 1988. But there were 150 distinct Lutheran bodies. These are some of our predecessors that led in and became part of the ELCA. The American Evangelical Lutheran Church was Danish, and in 1964 it merged with the Lutheran Church in America, or United Lutheran Church became Lutheran Church in America. And they had Danish background. The American Lutheran Church, and I don't have this for all 31 of them that I'm going to show you, but I'll point these out. This is my background, the American Lutheran Church. It was a merger of Iowa Synod, Michigan Synod, and the Ohio Synod back in 1930. And then in 1964, we became very broad-minded. We're all German. We became very broad-minded, and we brought in some Danes, and some Norwegians who outnumbered us. They let us know that. And formed the American Lutheran Church. So American Lutheran Church became the American Lutheran Church as we absorbed the Evangelical Lutheran Church and the United Evangelical Lutheran Church and whatever else. Anti-Missourian Brotherhood, just a little small group broken off, decides they need to become part of something larger. Why? Why? Number one, to get education, to train pastors. That was really foremost in mind. I'm a graduate of Capital University. Capital University was founded originally as a preacher school. It was in a house, and there were 2 or 3 guys studying under Pastor Schmidt, and that was back in 1850, something like that. And within 10 years, the college began to grow, and they moved out from downtown and got some land and became landlocked later. The Association of Evangelical Lutheran Churches, I'll talk about in a little bit. They're very important for us, very important for us. Swedish Augustana Evangelical Lutheran Church joins together with the Danish group back in 64, 65. And then you have some other groups coming in. If you see one that you know or recognize, I'll try to give you what I know about it. These are just alphabetical. The Evangelical Lutheran Church, United States, Evangelical Lutheran General Synod of the United States of America. That was the one in Pennsylvania that Muhlenberg brought together in 1748, something like that. Evangelical Lutheran Joint Synod of Ohio, the Synod of Iowa, Evangelical Lutheran Tennessee Synod. There was a large group of Lutherans that lived in Tennessee and still are. They're part of the Southeastern Synod. The Finnish Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. You try to track down Finns on your computer sometime, and you find it's difficult to really get to when did they come. I have, that they started in Calumet, Michigan, and they were the only, they had a college up there that was called Suomi College for many, 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 many years. It's now called Finlandia University. It's in Houghton, Hancock, part of Houghton. So if you ever go up there, it is the only private university in the northern peninsula of Michigan. And Michigan's filled with private colleges. Like Ohio has 65 of them. And I think Michigan has 50 some. So that's the only one that's up there. The Frankian Synod. Now with a name like that, it's named after somebody named Frankie probably. It's got to be German. That's all I know. The General Council of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in North America. Remember that one in connection with the Evangelical Lutheran General Synod of the United States of America. They tried to merge. Ultimately, they have merged, but they tried to merge way back. The Hauge Synod. Anybody ever heard of the Hauge Synod? I served with the Hauge honor. My senior pastor, when I was an associate pastor in Wisconsin, my senior pastor was a Hauge honor. And you have to have a conversion experience to be a Hauge honor. And a conversion experience is where, and basically it'd be like an altar call that you stand up. And he answered that at age 14 and later went to college, but then dropped out, went into the military, became a chaplain's assistant, went back to college, went back to the seminary, and became a Lutheran pastor. But he was proud that he was a Hauge honor from the Dakotas. Here's just a few more. The Lutheran Free Church, that's the third one. Lutheran Church in America comes about in those are the years that I could pick out big things happening. This, of course, is the 1964 one, United Lutheran Church in America. So we ask, why so many? Why do we have so many synods? Number one, ethnicity. When you come to America and you speak German, who are you going to associate with? Germans. If you're a Swede, who are you going to associate with? Swedes. And so they founded these little colonies, these little places. Who's been to Wisconsin? New Glarus, Wisconsin. That was a Swiss settlement, and now they've rebuilt much of the downtown with that Swiss architecture. So it's a very interesting one. So ethnicity became important until second or third generation said, you know, my kids speak English at school, I really ought to do something here at the church. Distances. Yeah, okay, I'll use this one. Remember I pointed out those two groups on the previous slide? The General Council and the General Synod. The General Synod was Philadelphia. The General Council was Western Pennsylvania. Any of you from Pennsylvania here? Okay. They joined together. But all of a sudden they started scratching their heads. And this is in the late 1800s. There were no telephones. How would you set meeting times? Where would you hold them? You don't go hopping on a horse and go over the Allegheny Mountains in the middle of winter. So all the meetings would have to be held in the summertime. So you saw geography separating. They had a very nice separation, but they said this just ain't working because we're just too spread apart. And until technology comes into play, and you really see that when the ELCA comes into existence, what technology has done. Communication. How do you communicate with no phones? Send a Pony Express rider across the mountains, whatever it would happen to be. Still not many English materials. That's why they tried to get together. But there weren't many English materials. So what's a synod? A synod in Greek means coming together. A coming together of people. We are part of the Florida Bahamas Synod here. And that's 200 churches, roughly 180 some now, that come together every year for an assembly to encourage one another, always have speakers from the outside, to do mission together. We send in our benevolence to them so that they in turn can keep half and send half to Chicago to start new churches, to send out world missionaries. We'll show you some numbers of those in a minute. And so that's why we come together, to publish materials, to have retreat centers. A synod is also an ecclesiastical council. Now, somebody once said, what's the difference between a Lutheran pastor and a Roman Catholic priest? And the answer is, the bishop asks the priest to jump, and he says, how high? The bishop asks a Lutheran pastor to jump, and we say, why? And so there's your difference between the two. Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, LCMS, area groupings are not synods, they're called districts. I came out of a background prior to 1988, where our groupings were called districts. I was in the Michigan district, I was in the Ohio district, I was in the South Pacific district, Southern Wisconsin district. So we became a synod because the LCA had synods. And we said, why should a name like that keep us apart when we could be writing materials together and sending missionaries together and all the things that churches coming together could do?
For clarification, LCA, you're talking about Lutheran Church in America, was the other large body of Lutherans that formed that merger in 1988.
I'll point that out in a minute. I love her.
Well, we have a mixed marriage.
I know. She comes from an LCA background, and I come from an ALC background. And you put two German heads together. Anyway, our groups are called synods. We have 65 of them. 65 of them. I'll have those figures up there in a minute.
And the synods were all encouraged to name themselves geographically. That's why you will always have states or countries within the name, like Florida, Bahamas.
Texas, Louisiana.
Southwest, Eastern Michigan.
The only place Northwest,
Lower
Michigan Synod. Yeah, when we merged in '88 and divided, so that when I was in the Michigan District, and I happened to have been vice president of the Michigan District at one time, we included Toledo. We went down and picked up all those German Lutherans around Toledo, and we had about 140 churches, something to that amount. And then when the merger was being talked about and came about, I was on that task force. The LCA was all of Michigan. And they had about 140 churches. So we said, well, just divide it this way so we get about 140 here and about 140 there. Well, we cut off Toledo and they went with Northwest Ohio Synod. But we each were 140, 135 churches. And when we elected our bishop, they tried to give him a sweatshirt that said Northwest Lower Michigan Synod of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, all the way down. And each of the 65 synods is presided over by a bishop. So mergers begin. And the first significant merger was in 1917. 3 Norwegian synods merged. Show some openness there. In 1918, 3 German synods merged. They formed the United Lutheran Church in America. Those synods were out on the East Coast. That was Muhlenberg's background at that point. And so in the 1920s or so, the National Lutheran Commission was formed, and it's formed for a very important reason. It had 8 member churches, not just 8 congregations, but 8 member synods or churches. And they came together because they were concerned for the spiritual well-being of the United States service personnel during World War I and those who were being sent into combat. In 1930, 3 other German origin churches merged to form American Lutheran Church. That's where my roots are, and my roots, of course, were in Ohio. Now, disregard all the lines. You're going to see them all come together here in a minute as we talk about our generation. Just in our generation, in 1960, the American Lutheran Church, the United Evangelical Lutheran Church, the Evangelical Lutheran Church, and the Lutheran Free Church all merged to become the American Lutheran Church, headquartered in Minneapolis, Minnesota. American Lutheran Church was Germanic in background. United Evangelical Lutheran Church was Danish in background. They happen to have been the Holy Danes. You can ask me later about why are they the Holy Danes. The Evangelical Lutheran Church was Norwegian. They were the largest of the groups. And the Lutheran Free Church was also Norwegian. Lutheran Free Church, it's very interesting. I think Pastor Luoma has that background. And they were a little hesitant to join in the merger. So they waited a couple years to see if this thing was going to really work. And then they joined with us in 1962 to form the American Lutheran Church. Meantime, the United Lutheran Church in America, located in Philadelphia, the Finnish Lutheran Church, which was in Calumet, Michigan at that time, the American Evangelical Lutheran Church, which are the Holy Danes, and the Augustana Lutheran Church, which were Swedish. They came together to form the Lutheran Church in America in 1962. Now, I'm leaving those up there, and I didn't make a separate slide of the next group so that you can see out of those 8 what happens, how they come together. The Association of Evangelical Lutheran Churches was a spin-off, a breakaway from the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod about 1980. And they ultimately became about 200 congregations because the National Lutheran Church Missouri Synod were really coming down hard on some of the professors at the seminary. And they only had 2 seminaries, and still do, St. Louis and Fort Wayne, Indiana. And they came down really hard and began releasing, kicking out, whatever you want to say, some of the professors for being too liberal. And as a result, those were some of the most popular professors, and they in turn came together and said, we're not going to be a separate church. We'll see if we can be a catalyst to bring about further mergers. And they formed the Association of Evangelical Lutheran Churches. They had a national bishop, but he didn't even serve full time. He was a pastor of a church. And so the 200 congregations were spread from California to Massachusetts, New York, down here to Florida. You know, they were just all over. But they really got to know each other. And they came together with the sole intent of bringing about a merger of other Lutherans who shouldn't be separated as they saw it. So they became the real catalyst. And so they brought together the Lutheran Church in America, which is this group, and the American Lutheran Church, which is the top group, to form the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America in 1986. That's when it was voted on. It's not when it became a reality. And I'll show that in a minute, because churches are churches. Like we have a Constitution Committee going here, they had to deal with that nationally. Are you going to call these districts, or are you going to call them synods? You're going to call them bishops, or are you going to call them district presidents? Those were big things. I didn't want to be bowing down to a bishop all the time. So, you had to think about those things. Now, because of some fellowship things that we did, I'll talk about fellowship in a minute, with the Anglican Church especially, and some of the rumors that just began to circulate nationally. This is, you're taking Church Politics 101 tonight, okay? And the rumors that began to spread nationally, there were pastors that just led their congregations out of this church that had merged because you become too liberal and you've given in too much to those other ones. And so you have, those pastors came together to form Lutheran congregations and mission cooperating. Now, they have, I'm going to try to say this in the nicest possible way.
Good luck.
You want to explain it there? They came together and discovered how difficult it was going to be to form a synod on their own. They came together because they thought our church was going to hell. Was not behaving rightly, and that because we got along with the Anglicans, the Episcopalians, they thought that was something very, very terrible. We had one church in South Carolina left our synod and joined with that group because we ordained women, and they didn't believe in that. And basically, they were churches that followed their pastor. And that's how the church began back in the 1700s here in America, was churches following their pastors. And so they formed this group, but they ran into a problem. Now, what do you do, Piper, with your retirement? How about health insurance? Where does all this come into play? And so that group has kind of evolved into the North American Lutheran Church. We have one of those in our area, meets in a manufactured home community up on 441. Used to be called, 3/4 of those people were called St. John Lutheran Church, who is now in merger talks with us. And because those people felt, why do we have to leave? And of course, all the constitutions of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America now state that if everybody leaves the congregation and 2 people remain, that congregation belongs to the synod and not to all the people who left. So we have a small group of people out there. Peg's working on that committee, and I've preached out there 3 or 4 times. Just a great group of people. Lovely setting. Sits right on Lake Weir.
Little Lake Weir.
Little Lake Weir, and you can look out the front windows. Here's the altar and the stained glass, and then there's 2 side front windows where you can see the lake. It's really kind of neat.
I want to just clarify something you just said. 3/4 of that congregation went to followed their pastor,
Right.
and went to the North American Lutheran Church. What the group that we are considering merging with are the 1/4 that's left.
Right. Did you all get that? Bill? Al? Okay. Jim?
You had mentioned the clear glass windows that stained glass. It's very difficult to listen to a sermon because when you're sitting there, you're looking out at the lake and you see someone going by on water skis, and you're trying to concentrate what the pastor said. It's tough.
Yeah, you have to kind of look at the pastor like that.
you talk about the politics in the church. In 1984, I was in the Air Force and stationed over at Patrick, and I belonged to an American Lutheran Church mission. And I was the representative to the Synod. And it was at the time when the merger was being considered,
Yes.
1984. And so the big discussion between the pastors and the bishop was who was going to be the bishop of the new synod.
Right. Oh yeah. There got to be church politics. Some places it was cut and dry who would become the bishop. Other places there were those that both felt, maybe two or three felt that they should be the bishop. And like this year, we elected a new bishop in Florida Bahamas Synod, and there were 3 candidates. They not only had gone through interviews, they had expressed what their theology was, their thinking, and they had time before the assembly to discuss what they believed the synod ought to be, and Bishop Pedro Suarez was elected. Yes,
With the recent,
Karen.
with the recent departure of many Lutheran churches into what is the Lutheran Church and Mission to Christ, is that part of this particular group, but just 10 years later, or
Yeah.
approaching that?
Somewhat like that, but this group is not that big. We're only talking about 100 churches, and you see that we have 9,000. Now, I'm not saying that we got more than they do, but it's a big process to leave, and once you've decided to leave, you've alienated a lot of your friends, is what really happens. And so you no longer have, like, a good example. None of these churches left as far as I know. But every year in Wisconsin, our conference we were 14 churches, we would come together at Lutherdale and team teach confirmation kids at camp. And we have about 230 kids at camp. That's all the place would hold. But every year, we would take them to camp. Like in our situation, our church paid 3/4 of the way for each of the kids to go to camp. And those were the kind of friendships that were lost when someone leads a group astray for some theological reason. And usually it is a theological reason. And those go back all the way to when they first came to America. And that's why there were 150 groups. And today, I'll put the number up there in a minute, there are still 21 synods in America.
Well, my best friend from high school and into college, who is married to a Lutheran pastor, and they were in Guam for 9 years before they came back and went to Arizona, and they're right in the heart of a Mormon area. And that church left the ELCA and went to Mission in Christ. And that has really been a difficult thing even for them in terms of their relationship, because she helped form a lot of colleges in the islands outside of Guam to bring all of those island people who wouldn't have anything to do with each other to finally come together and be,
Right,
be working together.
good
So,
example.
yeah.
But
It's a
they
very small
probably-
church, and it was one that was almost at the point of folding
Yeah.
when they took it over. They had, 16 people that were left there when they went, and they started to build that up, and then that group decided to do that. So
Yeah,
it's a struggle.
it is a struggle. You're dealing with human beings, sinful folk, saved by the grace of God. Al's got a question, huh?
I grew up in an ALC congregation in a small town in Minnesota. And the large church was in town, and there was 7 country churches surrounding that town within maybe 10 miles. After the homosexual issue, all of those rural churches voted to leave. I thought they went to a group called The Word.
Well, there's another group called The Word. It's a smaller group yet.
And even the big church in town voted. It didn't pass, but they voted
Right.
to leave. But they did lose maybe a third of their members.
Mm-hmm. Yep. That's happened throughout the Middle West.
Period of the last like 4 or 5 years that
Yeah. Well, that was, I'm trying to think when that vote was at Assembly, 2009. Yeah. Okay. So all is not sweet and wonderful. We're not in heaven yet. Okay. Evangelical, this is to tell you a little bit, and here is where technology comes into play. It's really kind of neat what happened. We really came into being in 1982. The Association of Evangelical Churches, the American Lutheran Church, and the Lutheran Church in America all met at different locations, different cities throughout the United States. And by a telephone hookup is when they voted to go ahead with merger talks. And so the vote was cast by all 3 groups, pretty unanimously. And so they voted to affirm an intent to merge. Why I got the heebie-jeebies on these, I don't know. But the official vote was taken in simultaneous conventions in 1988. And those conventions were 86. I'm
86.
sorry, 86. Because if they're going to have to work on the documents, and that takes a couple of years to drop. What do you do? You've got a mission department. You've got an outreach department. You've got some other kind of division over here. How do those come together, and what kind of focus do you give to this group? Mission, outreach, what's it going to be? So you got to name all these things. You've got to decide the big question. Where is the headquarters going to be located? That was probably one of the biggest questions to deal with. We didn't have to worry about that in Michigan. We knew that LCA had headquarters in Detroit, and so did we, so we're split it down the middle. We were going to sell off our property, and jointly we would find a home in Lansing, a very nice home in Lansing. So they were at simultaneous conventions, and they voted to merge, and the work began on the documents. The ELCA began its work on January 1, 1988. I remember that date very clearly because that was the date I was installed as the pastor of a former Association of Evangelical Lutheran Churches that had been just kind of wandering around out there, having trouble finding where they were. They were without a pastor. And so I started serving them on April when I got off the road from hiring 68 camp staff. How'd you like to have that job? January, February, and March in Michigan, you're traveling colleges trying to find 68 people for camp staff. But after I got off the road, I told them I would call them back just to fill a Sunday because they were trying to get pastors to fill up a Sunday. And so I called them back and said, yeah, I could do it. And the next Sunday was 2 weeks before Easter. And so after church, the head of the worship committee came up and asked me, she said, we have 5 children who need First Communion, and they've had no instruction yet. Could you come in and give them some instruction? Good old Piper said, yeah, I might as well do that. And could you preach next week on Palm Sunday? Yeah, that'll be all right, because I was planning to go see my mother on Easter weekend. I'd never had an Easter weekend off. So I preached on Palm Sunday, and then I got steamrolled by a couple of them into preaching on Easter. And he said, well, as long as you're sticking around town, why not do Maundy Thursday and have First Communion for those kids that you're teaching, and do the joint good. We always had a joint Good Friday service. So that's kind of where it was. And I was given what's called extended ministry, because I was ordained and I was rostered in the evangelical, the ALC at that time. And so the bishop worked it out so that on the first day, the first Sunday, which was January 2nd of '88, I would get installed and no longer be on extended ministry. So that was what I call a redevelopment mission, and it was a great church. It's where I left to go to South Carolina. Many times I wondered why I did, but I did because I'd shoveled my share.
And the pastor's always the first one there on Sunday morning, so.
Yeah, that's right. Well, I often had to do it. Okay, who are we? We're the fourth largest Protestant group in America. 3,600,000 members baptized. Our headquarters are in Chicago. We are guided by presiding Bishop Elizabeth Eaton. She's the first female bishop we've had since the church came into being in 1988. And so she's from northeastern Ohio, up in the Ashtabula area. Before that, we had, first one was Bishop Preuss, who had, it's interesting, he had a Norwegian background. And then Bishop Anderson had a Germanic background in South Carolina, and he went up there. And after him, I can't even remember who. No, Schaefer was here, Florida. But anyway, someone preceded. She's our fourth bishop since '88. She's elected, or a bishop nationally can be elected to a 6-year term and can go for re-election once. We don't operate like the United States government, where these people have 50-year whatever. We won't even get into that. Okay. We also have 65 synods, everywhere from Northeastern Synod. Is that the name of yours, Bill? New England Synod. That takes in Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont,
Massachusetts, Rhode Island, I think part of Connecticut, and maybe a little piece of New York State.
Okay. That's one of our it's geographic, but it's geographic by calling it New England Synod. Now, you get over to Minnesota or down to Pennsylvania, both of those states have 6 synods. So if you figure a synod has 150 to 200 churches in it, you've got 1,200 Lutheran synods in Pennsylvania and another 1,200 in Minnesota. Wisconsin is divided into 3 synods. Ohio is divided into 3 synods. Down here, we're just Florida, and we have 1 church in the Bahamas. And so we call it, in all equality, the Florida-Bahamas Synod.
And Wisconsin, Michigan.
And Wisconsin, Michigan. That's, yeah. Well, the UP is a separate synod on itself.
But they also have an association.
They have some over into Wisconsin. What's the name of that synod?
Because they're from Minocqua up.
Right. Yep. And Tom, I was trying to think who Tom, I knew the bishop very well at one point, but when you do things nationally, he just retired a couple years ago.
Scranes was bishop for a long time.
Oh, he was a bishop, yeah.
And then the Jolton and
Yeah. But that's another one, That takes in a little bit of Wisconsin, but then there's still 3 other synods in Wisconsin. So you have, you can figure, if you figure roughly 150 to 200 churches per synod, you can do the multiplication, and out of 65 synods, you're going to end up with 9,000 congregations. Bishops of the synod are elected for 6-year terms. They too can only repeat once. Our interim bishop down here, after Bishop Schaefer resigned, came from northwestern Ohio. And he'd been tremendously loved, cared for, and you could see it just in the 7 months, 9 months that he put in down here. They tried to get his arm twisted to run for bishop down here. And that has happened, where a bishop has served 12 years in one synod and gets elected by another synod. But he says, no, I'm retired. That's it. So I don't blame him. I'm looking forward to the day. The 65 synods are divided into 9 regions. Now, the regions, our church, I'm going to be honest with you, has never discovered what the purpose of a region is, except for one thing. You can imagine when it comes time, as it did about 2-3 weeks ago, that all the seniors who are graduating from seminary sit there waiting for the word to come out as to what region they're assigned to. And so each region sends one bishop as their representative. They kind of rotate that. And then they look at, what are there? This year, there were like 100 candidates. They decide who they'd like to get, and they vote on it, and sometimes somebody wins and sometimes somebody doesn't. It's like, they put up their best political, ecclesiastical front to say, I have a church where this person would just fit perfectly. We had one such experience in South Carolina. I had a mission that when I began as mission director, it was September. And when we got to December, I got a phone call from a church that said, our pastor just said he's resigning next week. He'll be gone.
And this was a mission church.
This was a mission church. They were meeting in a school cafeteria. And they were angry. Oh, they thought, we'd let him down. It's your fault. We're Lutherans. We say, why should we jump? Not how high. And so we got this guy lined up that we don't like, but he said he'd fill in for us at Christmas. I said, no, I'll fill in. So I drove the 100 miles each way Christmas Eve. Then I went back 2 days later on 26th or 27th, I forget which it was, and met with the whole congregation, which now numbered roughly 100 people. It was a great little church. And so I did my best to say, we'll do our best to find a good pastor for you. That doesn't mean we're going to assign him. You're going to have to call him. You'll interview him and see if this is what you really think you want. And so the bishop and I got together a couple weeks later, and I said, David, you got to go with me down there. And he said, okay, let's find a date that we all can go, and we'll meet with our council. And we went down there and met together with the council. But all the way down, the bishop and I are talking about who we think would be a good one for that spot. And we came to a very quick conclusion because I had just learned of this fellow, and the bishop knew him pretty well. It was his second career, just a fantastic individual. And he fit in. Serving a Del Webb community, okay, it was at Hilton Head, all right? You might as well know. And you're serving a Del Webb community as well as all the people down on Hilton Head. And John went in there and just, well, the only thing I had to do after he got there was, because I was the mission director, I had to swing a trade of land. Over Chicago wasn't too happy about it because my predecessor had bought land right on the main drag, 273, I think it is, that goes into Hilton Head. Now, you can imagine, think about it, us 75, 78, 79-year-old people going out into a 55-mile-an-hour street after church on Sunday morning, or decelerating coming in. And all we had was 4 acres. And so talked to the developer right behind where our property was, and he, in fact, was ready to call us. And he said, you know, we'd like that for commercial space. We can give you some land somewhere else in this development. It was a huge development. So we went down, or I went down, and with the pastor then, we looked around and we bargained a little bit and got a little better piece of property, I thought, and ended up with 7 acres. That church is probably 1,000 members today. 2 pastors, just, it was the right person at the right time. And that's how you trust that the Lord's going to bring some of these things together. But we had to get him assigned to our region first. And so our bishop went up at the region meeting and said, I want him. I don't care who else you give me. I want this guy. So we got him that way. We have approximately 240 missionaries. More than half of them are lay people. We also have a young adult in mission program, which are for students who graduate from college. They don't quite know what they want to do. Some of them think maybe I ought to go to seminary, maybe not. You know, they just don't quite know what they want to do other than they want to be of service to the church. And so I think this year we have something like 60 YAMs, Young Adults in Mission, traveling throughout the whole world and going to various places to bring about, and they make a 2-year commitment. And they try to raise their own dollars to do that. We have 9,000, roughly, congregations, give or take 100 at any given time. 17,000 pastors, many of whom are retired right now. And we do, in the ELCA, have a pastoral shortage. And we need, that's why we're having trouble here, trying to find someone who's interested or get the synod. Never mind. Because it's the synod who gives us the names of people that we can interview. But we have 17,000 pastors. I think most of them are retired in Florida or Arizona. We have 26 colleges and universities. That's very interesting because when you look back at all these mergers I was showing you, you end up with Suomi, which becomes Finlandia University, a Finnish background. Capital University, which has a Germanic background. Wartburg has a Germanic background. Augustana has a Swedish background. Augsburg has a Norwegian background. And then it goes all the way out to, we've got one in Washington, Pacific Lutheran University, one in California, California University, Lutheran University. So we're spread out. And some of them are struggling, some of them are just really going gangbusters. Sue.
Do we have a seminary like Fort Wayne and St. Louis? Or do our upcoming pastors come from colleges and universities?
We have the same requirement of our pastors as Lutheran Church Missouri Synod would, which is you must have a 4-year degree to get into seminary. Then you go to seminary for 4 years and get a master's degree. Whoopee. You'd think other people go for a year and they get their master's degree. We have 8 seminaries. throughout the United States, all of which used to be independent. And in the merger in '88, they were all independent of colleges, even though they might be located near colleges. I went to Trinity Seminary, which is right across the street from Capital University. It used to be part of Capital University, but in '88, it had to separate off. Actually, '64, it had to separate off. And now they're back together. The seminary, Trinity Seminary, is now the Theological School of Capital University. We have Lutheran Southern Theological Seminary in Columbia, South Carolina. It's now Theological School of Lenore-Rhine University in North Carolina. We just had 2 seminaries merge in Pennsylvania. They now are the United Lutheran Seminary, but they're still on 2 campuses. They couldn't get either one to budge. So one's in Philadelphia, one is in Gettysburg. So that there's 2 seminaries there.
Well, Hamma merged with.
Hamma was in Springfield, Ohio, and it merged with Trinity, or with ELTS, to become Trinity. So we have and they have their separate faculties, but the faculties can now spill over, say, and teach a religion course at the university. And university students can plan ahead and maybe take a Greek course over at the seminary ahead of time. So that there is this interplay. The main reason why it's happening, I think, is financial, so that you don't have an overlap of development directors, people trying to raise funds, people calling you on the phone. If you're a graduate of, any who's a graduate of university know that you get those semi-annual phone calls. So that that way you only have to have one registrar for the university, and that includes the seminary. You only need one treasurer, and the list goes on what the savings is administratively.
Minneapolis has the, in St. Paul, it's
Luther.
yeah.
Yeah. There used to be a St. Paul. It used to be a St. Paul seminary there, but they actually merged with Luther.
What would be the? I grew up in Missouri Synod. I was just wondering, what is the difference between what the seminary in St. Louis would teach versus the seminaries of ELCA?
We'll hold that class in May. Basically, I don't have. Let me put it this way: if there is no simple answer. Okay, it probably is a little bit more political in the Missouri Synod than it is for us. Our seminaries are pretty well independent. Their 2 seminaries are pretty well governed by their national president. And they have 4 vice presidents then. Meyer is their vice president now. Oh, what is the president's name? I try to forget it anyway. Okay. This, I think, is what's really neat. We have the largest nonprofit social service system in America. Who'd you say?
Matt Harrison.
Matt Harrison
He's the president.
is now the new president of largest nonprofit social service system in America. That's Lutheran Social Services. We have Lutheran Family Services of Carolina. We have Lutheran Family Services of Florida. They consult once a week in my office, just part of the service to us. The Good Samaritan Society, which many of you have probably heard of, is Lutheran in its nature, in its background, in its corporation. Okay, very quickly. Today in the United States, there are 8.7 million Lutherans, 21 different synods or bodies. ELCA, 3.6 million. LCMS has, that's Missouri Synod, has 2.6 million. WELS, Wisconsin Evangelical Lutheran Church, has 400,000 members. And those 3 comprise 95% of the Lutherans in America. I just have 2 slides if you don't mind. Today in the world, there are 60 million Lutherans in the world. Germany has 14.7 million. 14 million of them probably don't go to church, but North America has 8.7 million, and that includes, we have Lutheran churches, a couple Lutheran churches in Mexico, and we have a whole synod up in Canada of numerous Lutheran churches. Sweden has 7.6 million, Finland 4.6. I want to get down to the bottom number here. We have 6.5 million Lutherans in Africa, where Lutheranism is growing the fastest of anywhere in the world today. I'm going to be showing a DVD in 2 weeks that will talk about the growth of Christianity in Africa. Not just Lutheran, but all Christianity in Africa. This is the interesting one. The Malagasy Lutheran Church doubles in size every 10 years. Those people just reach out and continue to draw in more people and bring meaning to their lives. There was a point at which that was only 100,000 people, and now it's up well over 1.5 million. So that's the world, and maybe next week we ought to start by talking about cooperation. Would you rather that we talk about what we believe and teach, or the background of some of these churches and how they got to America and where they landed and stuff like that? What would be your preference? Background? Okay, I'll do my best to find the time somehow. And I do appreciate all of you being here.